When the academic year begins to wrap up around March and April and students start preparing for exams, everything from the student unions, campus organizations, to program unions go into election mode. And with a seemingly never-ending barrage of emails, they make sure you're aware of it. Very aware. And this year, just like the last two I've been at this university, I've ignored them. And let's be honest, you probably did as well. And I honestly can't blame you. But one does stand out from the crowd. And not just because it usually goes out a full month before the rest, but because unlike the rest, this election decides the composition of the governing council. While the unions often represent and make decisions on behalf of very niche slices of the student population, the governing council is the university's supreme and only real decision-making body. It influences everything from the university's overall budget all the way down to the intricacies of curriculum design. If you can think of something that the university does, chances are they were the ones who approved it. And despite inducting 14 new members to its ranks this year, 8 of them students, most of us don't exactly understand what this body is, nor how it came about, which is strange considering how vital it is to the governing and administration of just about everything at UofT. So today, let's take a deep dive into the governing council and understand exactly how a single body came to control almost everything to do with running UofT, so that maybe next time, you give a certain email just a bit more thought. In a lot of respects, managing a university government is a lot like managing a real-life government, and every government has mechanisms to create and implement policies. A university is no different. For this video, we're not so interested in how policies are implemented, but more how they're created, and the ultimate authority to create policies in UofT lies within the governing council. This is a body consisting of 50 members, headed by the university's president and a chancellor. Inside the governing council are a number of smaller bodies, 3 boards, 2 campus councils, and a number of more specialized or ad hoc committees, as well as a body known as the College of Electors, which is charged with selecting the chancellor every 3 years. But for all intents and purposes, the business, academic, and university affairs boards are the cornerstones of the governing council. A small cohort of the council's overall membership is assigned to each of these boards. These cohorts are rotated and reshuffled every now and again to ensure that members don't get too entrenched in their roles. The reason for this is because most of the university's foundational policies originate from one of these boards in the form of a draft policy. Now, a board may be given the authority by the governing council to pass a draft policy itself, if the matter in question just isn't that important. But most of the time, drafts will bubble up to the governing council's main decision-making body for a final review. Here, all 50 members of the council will be able to make considerations about the draft policy that perhaps the submitting board wouldn't have been able to make. Most of the time, these considerations are financial in nature. And once a draft policy is adopted, it's immediately in effect. And alongside the boards and committees, the university has 2 dedicated campus councils for UTM and UTSC. These function effectively as mini governing councils, focusing on the separate affairs of both of the other campuses. While there are inevitably matters that can only be handled at the wider university level, the campus councils give UTM and UTSC a greater degree of autonomy in determining local matters than if the governing council were to make all the decisions for them. For example, each UofT campus has its own campus plan. The UTSG plan is approved by the governing council at large, much like any other university policy. But the UTSC and UTM plans must be approved by their own campus councils. And aside from the campus councils and the boards are the ad hoc committees of the executive board. These are established and dissolved depending on the changing needs of the governing council, and are by no means permanent like the other boards are. The committees are usually tasked with handling niche matters like handing out honorary degrees and naming the university's many buildings, among other things of course. And should they no longer be needed, they're dismantled. So this is all well and good, but why does it matter if we, as students, know how the university takes some seemingly menial decisions about its day-to-day operations? Well, basically, there are 2 reasons. First, it's because UofT is one of the only universities in Canada that structures its government in this way, and it has been for over 50 years. And secondly, and most importantly, it's because we almost implemented a much better system. Let me explain. When it comes to structuring a university administration, there are 2 ways to go about it. You can opt for either a unicameral or a bicameral system. Most universities in Canada have the latter, a bicameral system. That means there are two decision-making bodies in charge of running the university, a board of governors which consists of a small set of administrators and non-academic personnel, and another called a senate, which is a much larger set of academic staff organized like a legislature, thus the name. Under a bicameral system, the Senate would be in charge of determining academic matters and the intricacies related therein. Think of things like curriculum design, faculty organization, and admission policy, while the Board of Governors would focus purely on administrative and business matters like capital projects and creating a budget. But U of T operates one of the only unicameral systems of any university in Canada. In other words, only the Governing Council exists to make all of these decisions. And to understand why, we need to look at some history. In the 1960s, most students, staff, and even administrators began to grow tired with the university administration's seemingly crippling inefficiency. Students at the time who were already becoming quite adept activists began to protest the university's existing governance structure, which they believed left them without a voice. Teaching staff, on the other hand, not only had an academic interest in how the university was being run, but a financial interest too. Even then, President Claude Bissell was openly voicing opposition to the bicameral system, establishing a presidential commission in 1968 whose job was to submit a proposal to the provincial government on a new way of managing the university. Bissell, and many others like him, believed that the main problem with the bicameral system was that both bodies were making decisions in a vacuum. Essentially, if the Senate was in charge of only academic matters and the Board of Governors only administrative matters, then how would either one know the full repercussions of their decisions? Well, in short, they didn't. The best way to describe this is as a translation problem of sorts. Essentially, the administratively oriented board never understood the academic dimension of their decisions, and the Senate didn't understand the administrative side. So the president would often need to step in between the two, and over time his job evolved into being a mediator of sorts. This distracted from the president's actual job of, well, running the university. So Bissell questioned the rationale behind having two decision-making bodies in the first place. After all, why separate the academic from the administrative when both dimensions of governance were inextricably linked? Many agreed that his idea was sound, and by 1970, the commission he created had generated a report agreeing on two guiding principles that would need to be observed in the establishment of a new unicameral governing body: representation and parity. They reasoned that if the university is to be controlled by just one governing body, as opposed to two, it ought to do a very good job in looking like the university population that it governed. They also believed that students and staff should be viewed equally before the government of the university, being given more or less equal representation on the governing council. By all accounts, this would have been the most democratic university governance system in all of Canada by far, if it were adopted. You see, the initial proposal for the governing council was built very much in line with these principles. Some would have said a little too much. Initially, the council was designed to consist of 20 elected students, 20 elected staff, 20 members of the general public, who would have most likely been government representatives, and 6 members who would be considered ex officio, or unelected in other words. It was by no means perfect, but it had seemed that the university's decisions would largely be made by a committee representing those who would be most affected by them, with 60% of them being either staff or students. But some professors didn't agree with students holding that much sway over the new governing council, one that would be determining everything from the conditions of their tenure to their pay. Soon enough, a petition appeared, and it gained traction quickly. Big-name professors such as Donald Creighton and Northrop Frye would sign on. Yes, that Northrop Frye. And right before the committee released its report, the petition had gained more than 630 signatures, which at the time comprised almost 32% of the university's tenured professors. Not a majority, but it was certainly big enough to scare the commission. So the structure of the governing council was revised. Instead of a council of 66 members, its size was slightly increased to 72, but the proportions changed dramatically. Now, students only made up a measly 14 seats on the council, and teachers, 21. When added up together, teachers and students would now make up just under 49% of the council, a very slim minority. The commission was effectively strong-armed into abandoning parity, but the teaching staff would be largely placated. However, if you remember, aside from the staff and the students, there was still one more actor involved in university decision-making that we did not consider yet: the government. If the Ontario Legislature's central position on our campus says anything, it would be that U of T is a public institution first and foremost. For such a sweeping change to the university's governance structure to take place, Queen's Park would need to ratify it first, and the provincial government believed that U of T's status as a public institution necessitated public representation on its new governing council, and amended the Commission's proposal even further. Under the government's plan, the new council would fragment even further, consisting of 6 students, 6 alumni, 12 staff members, 2 presidential appointees, the president and chancellor themselves, and a whopping 14 government representatives. A later amendment even increased this number to 18. Even Bissell, who had resigned from the presidency by this point, appeared in a hearing on the government's proposal as a private citizen to oppose it. Sensing that the tide was quickly shifting against them, Queen's Park gave some ground, instead proposing the 50-seat governing council that we have today. It reduced both the number and proportion of government representatives to 16 seats, but still, at this point, the final iteration of the council bore little to no resemblance to the initial proposal made by the President's Commission, where students and staff would have both held 33% of the seats each. In a vast departure from the desires of the original Commission, there was to be little representation and no parity to speak of. So the question is, does unicameralism work? And if so, who exactly does it work for? Well, for starters, it's clear who it definitely doesn't work for: faculty members. Instructors, professors, and support staff have lost the most in terms of representation and political clout in the university system since the introduction of unicameralism. Academic staff used to hold total control over the entirety of the university's non-business-oriented policy through a Senate with almost 200 members. Today, their power is diluted in a governing council a quarter the size of the former Senate, with a myriad of other parties having sway over what they teach and how they teach it. A great deal of literature has been written about this trend of academic marginalization at universities. One of the most outspoken critics of this marginalization is Murray Ross, who wrote extensively on university governance in Canada. He commented that reforming a university government is nothing like reforming an actual government, and it's not hard to see where he's coming from. While a national or provincial government often acts simply as a regulator, happily delegating much of the burden of its policies to the private sector or to specialized authorities, a university government can't really do that, since it deals with highly technical academic and philosophical questions on a daily basis. Sometimes questions that only academics are fully equipped to answer. Another critic, Benjamin Ginsberg, who's a professor of political science at Johns Hopkins, wrote a book about this very subject in 2011, and he framed the issue like this: "Today's full-time professional administrators tend to view management as an end in and of itself. Most have no faculty experience, and even those who spend time in a classroom or laboratory hope to make administration their life's work, and have no plan to return to the faculty. For many of these career managers, promoting teaching and research is less important than expanding their own administrative domains. Under their supervision, the means have become the end." And what about us as students? Does unicameralism work for us more than bicameralism? Well, that answer may differ depending on how you look at the question. On the one hand, representationally speaking, the governing council falls well short of its original proposal in 1970. Students were poised to hold nearly a third of the council's seats after all. However, on the other hand, students had absolutely no representation to begin with under the old bicameral system, and while other Canadian universities have reformed their senates to include students, they can hardly be considered democratic or equal either. In some cases, U of T even outperforms them. But is this good enough? Well, an increasing number of students have been arguing in recent years that it isn't. After all, if student tuition comprises over 60% of U of T's annual budget, then is it truly fair that we represent just 16% of its only decision-making body? This point becomes even more important when you consider the fact that these very tuitions have increased significantly faster than the rate of inflation over the past 10 years, with international students suffering the most. Their fees have skyrocketed over 200% since the 2020 academic year, and it's not difficult to imagine that if student votes played a larger role in the governing council's executive body, decisions like tuition hikes would likely have never seen the light of day. But to be clear, this video's goal is not to bash on unicameralism, as it can still be a force for good provided that it's implemented democratically. And to its credit, it's already blazingly efficient. Even its detractors admit that much. And it's not difficult to see why. It cuts out a lot of the bureaucracy that was once associated with university work. After all, splitting up governance into two components and handing each one of them off to different bodies is bound to slow things down. The only way things can be made worse after that is placing these two bodies in an echo chamber and pretending that their actions have no consequences beyond the ones they can see. Ultimately, UofT's ongoing experiment in unicameralism has achieved exactly what it sought out to do: streamline decision-making. President Bissell, when designing his commission, did so with the intent of fixing an organizational problem, not creating a perfect democracy. And even then, there's nothing stopping us from striving towards that goal from where we stand right now. If you take it, much like the student and staff activists of the 1960s, that we can only benefit from increasing representation in our government, then creating a governing council that's democratic is not mutually exclusive with creating one that's efficient. But whatever you believe, one thing stands true, and it's that the story of the governing council is at its core one of compromise. A story of an idea developed to earnestly solve a specific problem, one that through repeated negotiation and compromise changed and evolved until it bore little resemblance to its original iteration. For better or for worse.